Hi everybody, welcome to Shisai Podcasts, conversations between scholars from around the world who study childhood, youth, and related institutions historically. As an official production of the Society for the History of Children and Youth, you can subscribe to these shows through iTunes or Google Play. Written and visual materials associated with each episode are available at our website, shcy.org. Enjoy.
Good morning, everyone. I'm so excited to be here with all of you today, and I'm honored to be chairing this wonderful panel. And I'm not only your chair, I'm going to provide you with my own personal comments and questions. So it's a double honor. Yes. So first of all, I'd like to briefly introduce our speakers, and then I'll give all of them 15 minutes for their presentations. So our first speaker is Sophie Bürgi, who is a PhD student at the University of Basel, Switzerland. Her PhD project is on the topic of smells in Graphic Memoirs. Sophie has a BA and an MA in Gender Studies and German Literature. And from 2015-2016, she co-led a research project about academic excellence at the University of Basel. In this project, she did interviews with university members asking what effect the imperative of academic excellence has on their working conditions and the life in the academia. She has taught many courses, for example, in gender studies, and apart from her work at the university, which makes her even more interesting, Sophie is also guiding city tours that focus on women's and gender history in Basel. So Sophie is our first speaker. Our second speaker today is M.K. Czerwiec, who is a nurse, a cartoonist, and educator who uses comics to reflect on the complexities of illnesses and caregiving. She is the creator of Taking Turns Stories from HIV/AIDS Care Unit 371 and a co-author of Graphic Medicine Manifesto. She also co-manages graphicmedicine.org. Her next book will be the edited anthology Menopause: A Comic Treatment. Yeah, it already sounds exciting. So our third speaker is Dominique Grisard, who is a historian, but also teaches gender studies at the University of Basel, so the same university, Switzerland, and directs the Swiss Center for Social Research. She is presently finishing a book-length project on pink, which is very exciting, which weaves a history of gender, sexuality, and whiteness through and around color. She has published a lot of different articles, she has taught many different courses, and we are all looking forward to reading her book on pink. And as you will see today during her presentation, she has already started working on a different color. Yeah. And our fourth speaker, our final speaker, is Jo Maynes, who is a professor of history at the University of Minnesota. She's a historian of modern Europe with interest in comparative and world history. Her work explores the social and cultural history of the family, gender and generational relations, class dynamics, and personal narratives. She has published many books, and she's currently working on a new one, possibly titled Making History While Young and Female Girls in Europe's Age of Revolution. So I decided to just shorten a bit your bios for the sake of giving you more time for your presentations. So Sophie, you're first.
Thank you. So I'd like to welcome you about my presentation about Lila Quintero Weaver's graphic memoir, Darkroom, a memoir in black and white. Here you can see the cover of this comic. Graphic memoirs have caught my interest because they do something with space. Which memories can take up space in our society? Who can speak about history and whose story is heard? I want to start my presentation by thinking about the space graphic memoirs create. The comic scholar Hilary Shute writes, Comics life narrative establishes what I think of as an expanded idiom of witness, a practice of testifying, that sets verbal language with and against visual languages in order to embody individual and collective experience, to put contingent selves and histories into form. Graphic memoirs, following Schutz's argument, are able to establish a new practice, a new way of doing. They are witnessing history. They can be used to testify against social injustice. Their combination of text and image shows embodied selves as part of a larger society, as part of a collective experience. In my paper, I want to talk about the space Darkroom is creating for the memoirs of a Latina writer who has witnessed racism and sexism against herself and also against other people of color. A strong feeling of solidarity is omnipresent in the comic's depiction of Black citizens' struggles for their rights. Darkroom is addressing the question of how to document trauma and how to witness history from an intersectional perspective. I'm interested in how Weaver uses the comic medium's combination of text and image to bear witness to individual and collective experiences of trauma. First, I will give you a brief summary of the book and show examples of the comic's narration of racism and sexism. Drawing upon Anne Svektovich's notion of documenting trauma, I will analyze Weaver's use of photography and film in her art. Finally, I will show how Weaver creates a space of her own with her graphic memoir, emphasizing the need to look at the embodied experiences of the past. Darkroom consists of 10 chapters, which are framed by a prologue and an epilogue. The story starts when the girl Lila is 5 years old and moves from Argentina to Marion, Alabama with her family. The book ends with Lila as a grown-up, traveling back to Argentina for the first time after her emigration. Darkroom can be described as a coming-of-age story, but is also more than that, as Janice Breckenridge and Madeline Peterson state in their article about the comic. The young adult graphic memoir merges divergent, if not competing narratives: an immigrant's tale, a coming-of-age story, a chronicle of the civil rights era, and a portrait of a maturing artist. So on the one hand, Darkroom shows Lila's migration and how she and her family are affected by discriminating norms of gender and race in the US. On the other hand, the comic also depicts political events of the civil rights movement that happened during the 60s and 70s. Lila's father witnesses some of these events as an amateur filmmaker and photographer. First, I'd like to focus on the personal experiences that are depicted in the comic. After moving to Marion, the protagonist Lila is trying to blend in, as she calls it. She describes the strict racial divides in Alabama society, as we can see in this panel. Looking at the style of the comic, Jorge Santos notes how Weaver often depicts white racist people drawn with these simple and cartoon-like lines that we can see here. And this is to highlight their two-dimensional thinking. So yeah, here we can see the white people that ask, what are you or where are you from? And they don't understand her identity. The narrator states that no one knew what Lila's ethnicity was. And white people are drawn with these lines that show that mainstream opinion. However, Weaver also draws herself with these simple lines when she reflects on her own bias. She was, as we can see in this panel, she was idealizing herself as a fighter for racial equality as a teenager, and is here kind of reflecting upon that, how she was kind of seeing herself as a Joan of Arc fighting. So, in my opinion, this image shows the self-reflection Weaver encompasses in her comic, acknowledging her own prejudice and also her own privilege. An example of the embodied dimension of racism and sexism can be seen in the comic's negotiation of the white ideal of beauty. It is represented in American women's magazines where neither Latinos nor Black women were visible. The struggle with white hegemonic femininity is analyzed more than once in the book. For example, Lila's sister Lizzie was ashamed of her lips that don't conform to white ideals of beauty, as we can see in this panel. So she's kind of tucking her lips back when her father is taking a picture of her. Lizzie also tries to change the shape of her nose, as we can see on this page, by pressing it against the window of the car. So even though the depiction of these two incidents is rendered in a funny and comic way, they nonetheless show the embodied dimension of racism and sexism in US society, where young Latino girls do not feel comfortable in their body. This intersectional perspective on norms of gender and race is also thematized in regard to the Black community. The comic shows the inequality of white men being able to openly objectify Black women, as we can see here in these panels. Black men, on the other hand, are worried about even just looking at a white woman, as we can see here. The comic gives many accounts of the oppression of Black people in everyday life. More and more, the young protagonist Lila begins to see racism very clearly. She also witnesses the changes in society due to desegregation that starts after the successful protests. Black kids start to join her school, and Lila has her first Black teacher, for example. These everyday experiences are framed by public events of the civil rights movement. By including the documentation of these public events in her memoir, Weaver emphasizes how childhoods are always embedded in historical context and saturated with political tensions, events, and identities of that time. In 1965, there were marches from Black protesters around the courthouse in Marion, where Lila lives. They protested for their rights to be registered to vote. At the center of the comic stands the dark night of violence against these protesters, which culminates in the murder of Jimmy Lee Jackson by a white policeman. The pages that depict this violence have a Black background, as we can see here. And this background both refers to the moral darkness of these events as well as to the impossibility of their documentation. The power had been cut, so it was impossible for witnesses like Lila's father, who was present at this event, to take pictures or film. Weaver uses juxtapositions like black and white as a narrative strategy to convey clear messages in her comic. The comic focuses on the bright, resisting community of Black citizens that protest against the discriminatory practices of society. It also shows the dark side of white conservative society that is full of violence, as we can see here. This event was supposed to remain in the dark and remain undocumented. Photographic equipment of journalists was vandalized by the white mob, as the narrator points out. With her comic book, Weaver is now shedding light on these traumatic events. I think the multimediality of the comic is important for depicting these traumatic events and also the more ordinary forms of racism and sexism I have mentioned before. In her book, An Archive of Feelings, Anne Svetkovich reflects on the ordinariness of trauma that is not always public. Everyday forms of racism, many of which are institutional or casual and thus don't always appear visible, except to those who are attuned to them, are among the effects of longer histories of racial trauma. This insight has been a crucial resource for me in tracking the diffuse effects of sexual trauma and the connection between catastrophic events and very ordinary ones. As Svetkovich points out, trauma puts pressure on traditional forms of representation, so that new forms emerge to document these violent encounters. In Svetkovich's work on Alison Bechdel's Fun Home, she notes, the act of drawing itself thus becomes an act of witness, while also giving rise to a collection of emotionally charged documents and objects. The photographs and film scenes that Weaver uses in her comic are such objects full of emotional value that she uses to document personal as well as collective experiences. The pictures Lila's father took are a political act of resistance, and so is her reproduction of these pictures in her comic. A memoir in black and white not only refers to race, but also to black and white photographic archive, the black and white photographic archive this comic relies on, as Jorge Santos points out in his article. The prologue of this comic is called Home Movies. We can see it here. On home movie nights, Lila's father shows his film recordings to Lila and her sisters and her brother. For example, the scene where protesters marched around the courthouse in Marianne. Lila's favorite part, as she describes here, of the movie night is at the end when her father rewinds the film and they see it all in reverse. Comics is a medium where time is depicted as space. The comic book gives the readers the freedom to look at the pictures as long as they want and in the order they want, other than in film, which is kind of referred to here, I think. At one point in the comic, the traumatic structures of oppression combined with teenage angst make Lila wish that she could just disappear, as we can see here. The process of female socialization and racial inequality makes it hard for Lila to find a space where she can be herself. We can see Lila's finger who is erasing her drawn self, taking her off the page. The father figure is Lila's eye in the public, documenting historic events, which in a way reinforces the gendered division of public and private. However, it is her mother who teaches Lila how to draw and to paint. While school is sometimes difficult for her because of racist discriminations, at home, Lila feels free to express herself as an artist, as we can see here. So in her memoir, Weaver combines her father's and her mother's artistic heritage of photography and film and painting, showing the personal is political. In combining these two art forms, she creates her own hybrid space for her memoirs that are embedded in historical events. To conclude, Virginia Woolf, in her essay A Room of One's Own, writes, "Intellectual freedom depends on material things. A room of one's own is vital to have intellectual freedom, to create your own perspective." Thinking about the lack of women writers in her time, Virginia Woolf urges women to write about whatever topic seems relevant to them. She writes, "Therefore, I would ask you to write all kinds of books, hesitating at no subject, however trivial or however vast. By hook or by crook, I hope that you will possess yourselves of money enough to travel and to idle, to contemplate the future or the past of the world, to dream over books and loiter at street corners and let the line of thought dip deep into the stream." I see the form of graphic memoirs as a room, a space for female artists to express their thoughts on ordinary events as well as vast subjects. At the end of the comic, we can see Lila again painting in her mother's picture, so it's the same picture again that we saw before at the end of the book. Above it, we see this unhappy-looking Lila that did not feel joy in studying art at university. However, this graphic memoir is the completion of her art degree that she did later. So through her graphic memoir, she has created a space to make herself appear again. To summarize, I argue that Weaver uses the multimediality of the comic and its characteristic to depict time as space to interweave her personal narrative with broader historical contexts, showing dramatic structures of sexism and racism. Like the rewinding of the film in the prologue of the book, this comic looks back. The possibility the comic book gives its readers to look at the pictures in any order they choose shows us the contingency of history that is always a matter of perspective, is always in the making. Through solidarity with the protesters of the civil rights movement, Weaver puts her childhood in a socio-historical context that gives us a broader picture of traumas caused by racist and sexist structures. The protagonist recognizes her own need to look at society's various forms of oppressions. The comic invites the readers to do the same, creating a space to look back and to rewind. "Why can't I just disappear?" Lila asks when she has no space to be herself. Weaver's book shows whose experiences shouldn't disappear from history and helps us to reflect upon the embodied experiences of the past that shape our present.
If not, I'll wait. Hi, thank you all for being here. I'm here to talk about the cartoonist perspective. I'm trying to do history and represent self in history. Stop moving. Do that. All right. So I can use that now?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So as Mateusz mentioned, I'm a nurse and a cartoonist and an educator who uses comics to help contemplate the complexities of illness and caregiving. And I could unpack that if you care later, but for now we'll just go with that. So my clinical nursing experience is in HIV/AIDS and hospice care. And some colleagues and I got together and did this book called The Graphic Medicine Manifesto, and it's a book that kind of puts a stake in the ground as why comics should be taken seriously in the discourse of health, illness, caregiving, and disability. And then parallel to that, I was also working in my own graphic memoir called Taking Turns, Stories from HIV/AIDS Care Unit 371. So my teaching, I teach at Northwestern, the Art Institute, University of Chicago, just basically doing this comics and medicine thing. But I'm here to talk about this book and the process of making it and thinking about childhood and how that helped. So a little backstory on the book. So Unit 371 of Illinois Masonic Medical Center, which is not very far from here in Chicago, had this Unit 371, which was one of the country's earliest dedicated AIDS care unit, which means that it was a specialized service, an inpatient unit with its own staff, its own volunteers, dedicated to the care of people with HIV and AIDS. And the unit was known for providing patient care that was cutting edge and highly respected, yet also occasionally unconventional. And what that image there was, at one time, was going to be the cover of the book, but it was the elevator doors opening and these sort of Broadway show posters as being kind of the first thing outside the door. And this image is some logbooks, which are basically probably the most concrete historical document of people moving through the place, and they are lost to history, unfortunately, as far as anyone knows right now. So, though nationally known and thousands of people came through this Unit 371, and the great majority of our patients died, I discovered that no formal record of this place existed, no public history. In contrast, the AIDS care unit at San Francisco General Hospital, 5A, 5B, actually has an archive in the entire, California library system. So I decided that as part of I always knew that I was going to make comics about this place because that's what I started doing, but I realized that I needed a lot more supporting documents. So I actually conducted an oral history as my master's thesis. The presenter notes don't seem to be working, so bear with me. I'm gonna just, I wrote this, I've got to know what it's gonna say, right? At some point. So the oral history had 25 narrators from diverse perspectives on the unit. I wanted staff and volunteers and kind of as many perspectives as I could get. It was conducted between 2008 and 2012. I used a life review format for the interviews, so where are you from? How did you get to this place? Tell me about this place. And then the bulk of the interview was that, and then how do you think about that time looking back now? So the unit was open from 85 to 2000, in case I didn't say that. And so I'm starting there in 2008, which is pretty soon after, relatively, that it closed, all the way up to 2012, so there's a little more perspective there. And then I transcribed all the interviews, and the narrators approved their transcripts, and they were able to redact anything that the reason it was really important to use, I think I put on here, that I used consent forms. It was really important because most of these people I had worked with and I knew, and I wanted to create a little bit of a distance and formalize that interview. So this was my thesis, which was text only. And then, as I mentioned, and I don't expect you to read these, but these are just 3 examples of early comics. I was not the kid who could draw. I was not someone who drew as an adult, but I started making comics while I was working as a nurse as a way to survive that difficult time and to be able to still connect to my patients, yet process those traumatic experiences. And this is actually an incredibly efficient medium for doing that, a little bit of image, text, in sequential fashion. That's comics, right? So I knew that I was going to be making comics about this place. So I combined kind of the visual sensibility that people had shared with me about the place, my memories of the place. I also had a lot of academic influences in this project. I was doing a master's in medical humanities and bioethics, so I very much was bringing in the influences and also from the arts as well as academics. And then I wanted to represent the science of the disease, right? So I wanted that to be a piece of this. and I wanted to represent the impact on the body. And a lot of this is formed by thinking through disability representation issues, and the ways in which we represent bodies. But also I really ultimately wanted the book to be an HIV/AIDS 101 for people who I realized were alive that had not experienced any of this and didn't really have an understanding of what had happened in this country. And so I wanted this to in some ways be like a starting point, and obviously they'd go elsewhere for more, but at least some introduction. And then I wanted to represent the medicine and the nursing concerns, the ways in which the difficulty of care and providing care in this moment, since we were in a care environment. And finally, I wanted to represent my patients. And I'll talk a little more about this in a second, but each of the stories that I use to represent is trying to bring along an important point that I'm telling through the story. And on the bottom right there, I can just say this now. I want to make it clear that I obviously have ethical responsibilities and legal restrictions when it comes to representing my patients. So I struggled with that a lot, because if you think about with the AIDS crisis, the Names Project, like, keep their names alive, but by HIPAA, I'm bound by not using their names. So the resolution I found for that is actually I combine about 3 to 5 patients in every one patient, so they're composite characters. So they're all very much represent people that I knew and loved, but I can honor all of my obligations. The only person in the far right there, the last panel in this set of 4, these are not sequential, these are just excerpted, is the only patient that I could find who could approve of his own representation, and I was able to interview him. Unfortunately, he did die before the book came out, but he did consent to both his physical representation and any text I would use. So integrating all of those things became a bit of a challenge. This is literally my desk, but I'm sitting down trying to do all of that. Initially in the project, I was not going to be in it. I was not going to be in it. This wasn't going to be my memoir. This was the story of the unit. But then ultimately I came around to realizing that when someone read my oral history and they said it was sort of like, I don't know what that expression is, like drinking from a fire hose, it was all too much, that I needed to sort of serve as kind of a guide through this, and also in some ways it was inauthentic. Like, obviously these are my memories and my memoir, and I have a place in this, and I want to hide, but I can't. So I decided to put myself into the story. Where am I going here? Okay, so again, don't have my presenter notes, but I think what I'm trying to point out here is that one of the biggest struggles of this is trying to figure out so if I'm going to be in this, who am I? Like, why am I there? Why am I providing care in this moment of time, in this history? How did I get, kind of like all the questions I'm asking of my narrators, I have to sort of establish and be able to answer for myself. And then there's this weird thing when you make a graphic memoir that Harvey Picar's widow, Joyce Bradner, talked about at one of our graphic medicine conferences, is that you have avatar you and you have real world you. And you have to kind of decide where the lines are. What does that mean? How do you make decisions about that? And so I was really struggling with that, particularly when I had these false starts with the book, and I had started making this book, and I was dove right into this one spot, and then I just realized, like, why is this, what is motivating this character, me, to be this nurse? Because my own father had just died months before. Why would I go to a place where I knew all my patients were going to die? And I realized there was a lot I needed to understand going back in terms of caregiving in my own life. So, frustrated by all this, one day I took my dog for a walk, and we came upon this tree that had been cut down. And of course, what a great metaphor, right? I came to realize, like, okay, I can create a map sort of based on this, right? And then sort of start to understand context. And this is a 2-step process that got me to doing this. This is the first step, is, and I'm going to use a handout that I made for students, because I've actually used this as a tool in teaching memoir, to try to kind of like understand where the things that happen in your life fall. So basically, that if you make a dot in the center of a page that represents your birth, and then you make a circle around that dot representing each year of your life, right? The rings of the tree. If you're old, use big paper. I've learned this. And so then you obviously can see where this is going, right? So then you sort of fill in stuff in it. Like, then you start writing like the year, and you kind of write the year out, and then you write your age, and then you write like things that happen. A good place to start is like what year you were in school, what your teachers' names were, just all these things that start triggering. And this obviously isn't something you sit and do once, you just kind of keep filling it in, right? And then you end up with this sort of like, you just keep filling it up, and before you know it, you have this sort of kind of record of what happened when in your life. So that was step 1. Step 2 then was, this is sort of what mine ended up looking like. So this is kind of, I got lazy and didn't do the full circles, but you see where we're going here. But then step 2 was I made a comic for every year of my life. I highly recommend this process. Just sort of like tracking kind of caregiving, intersection with hospitals. My mother was a nurse, so I talk a lot about that, and then kind of like the values I was taught, all of these things. And my hope was that, so this was the year before the book would start in 1993, my hope was, with having gone back, and none of this will really ever see, aside from things like this, the light of day, it's just this reference point. And then hopefully the plan would be that when I got to 1993, I'd have a much better sense of who Character Me was, informed by my experiences of childhood, looked at kind of in sequence and in terms of consequence. So then there we are, back, and I'm ready to kind of start back up. This is from Rush Medical Center near here, where I went to nursing school. They actually have 2 original Keith Haring murals that you can go visit. They're behind glass now, but plexiglass now, but they weren't at that time. So the only panel that ends up appearing from my childhood in the book is this one, talking about the influence of my mother, who was a nurse, making hospital corners as a child. So back at it, dove back in, kept moving forward, ended up making 1 million pages. This was the book. I did all the inks on paper and then scanned them into the computer and did the colors digitally. These are the edits. I thought I was done, but whoa, I was not. So this was the page where I was going to talk about the representation of my patients, but I've done that. And all of a sudden my presenter notes show up. So thanks a lot, guys. No, this is good because I wanted to read a quote, so this is good. So in the end I had a book. But of course when it first came out I was very sheepish about it because, sheepish isn't the right word, reticent about putting it out, and because obviously I'm not reticent about putting out, I did it. I guess what I'm trying to say is I really wanted to hear back from the people whose experiences I was representing and the place I was representing that I'd done it right. And also from historians that I'd done okay in representing this moment in history in this place at this time. I am very proud of this quote, if I can get it all, is that Mark O'Connell wrote in the Oral History Review, this first-person narrative supported by oral history testimonies from patients, other nurses, volunteers, and doctors, as witness to a terrible moment in American history, is riveting. The work here serves as a valuable reflection on and historical portrait of the AIDS hysteria of the 80s and 90s in America. So I've got some sense that I did okay, but ultimately I'll just sit through one of your presentations and maybe you can tell me how I did. So anyway, that's the book. Thanks.
Wow, tough acts to follow. Love these presentations. So my presentation, I'll be looking at color, the color of things. What is the role of color, color names, color experiences in queer and trans life narratives? How is coloring used to help narrate coming of age while coming out processes? Do coloring techniques manage to queer heteronormative life narratives? Are they able to queer the coming of age while coming out trope? This paper explores the form and function of painterly color in LGBTQ, etc. graphic memoirs from a queer perspective, or that's what I'm trying. Ever since Alison Bechdel's published Fun Home in 2006 to both popular and critical acclaim, there's been a strong LGBTQI presence in graphic memoirs and novels. Color, however, has remained an under-theorized element of these novels, and I'm, just starting, so this is just a start. My recent foray into color as a narrative and visual device in graphic storytelling builds on a long-standing research interest in the symbiotic relationship between gender and color, historically. Among other things, I have done extensive research on the gendered and sexualized use of pink hues in children's books and children's picture books since the 1990s, and also why pink doesn't figure actually in earlier children's books. I was specifically interested in the way in which the color pink came to signify feminine boyhood in stories of overcoming and preventing bullying. So in this presentation, I will share some preliminary thoughts on how color attaches to narratives and markers of gender and sexuality in graphic memoirs and autobiographically inspired graphic novels. From the rejection of anything pink signaling the young protagonist's disidentification with heterosexual femininity in Fun Home and Liz Prince's Tomboy, to the different blue tints, meanings, and affects in Julie Moreau's Blue is the Warmest Color, the hyper-gendered use of color in Sabrina Symington's First Year Out, and finally the black, gray, and white in Snapshots of a Girl by Belnan Zezin. I will trace the use of color as a shorthand and a label as a way for a protagonist to identify with gender and sexual norms, and as a technique to grab the reader's attention and evoke an emotional response. One of my main findings is that color is readily associated with feelings, and feelings with bodily sensations. Analyzing color in graphic memoirs may give us a glimpse at how gender and sexual disidentifications are narrated in ways that words and more conventional narrative panels cannot. So some of the concepts that I work with are deeply rooted in queer of color theory. I use the term disidentification in reference to Jose Muñoz's seminal book, Disidentifications, understood as neither an identification nor a counter-identification. It is a working on, with, and against a form at a simultaneous moment. I'm also indebted to a brief exchange I once had with Jose Muñoz about his project on Feeling Brown. In this presentation, I would like to think of gendered color codes as effectively latent and as expressing an effective difference, by which I mean the ways in which various historically marginalized groups feel differently and navigate the world in a different emotional register. Other concepts that I draw on are rooted in queering hetero and cis-normative life narratives, while also honoring the ways in which time binds us in very conventional ways. To quote Elizabeth Freeman, is there a queer practice of coloring that also helps queer the temporality of conventional life narratives? How may a particular coloring technique undergird queer temporalities, help us emotionally connect and empathize with the queer narratives presented to us? So most of the LGBTQI graphic memoirs discussed here disidentify with the heteronormative coming-of-age trope. That is, they grapple with the hetero and cis-normative life narrative without being really able to disavow its power. By the coming-of-age trope, I refer to a story featuring an adolescent making the mental leap from child to adult. In real life, this happens over the course of several years. In graphic memoirs, there's also space to develop that, but obviously relatively, little space. So it's, a life narrative is compressed, it's selective, obviously, it's constructed also, and some of the character development is accelerated. So stock themes are the idea that growing up sucks, that feelings of being misunderstood by adults in one's life, adolescent angst, gender performance of risky behavior, e.g. boys' harm and violent behavior towards others, and girls' self-harm, and tension within peer groups and in school settings, the need to face and overcome bullies. You're not going to be able to read this, but when it comes to LGBTQI coming-of-age stories, the standard trope is the coming-out story or the gender affirmation or transition story. While coming out certainly happens in real life, the coming-out story trope has certain standard stereotypical notes that every telling of it tends to hit, no matter who the characters involved are. The main character will at one point have one person in their life wholeheartedly support them, while at least another will turn out to be homophobic or transphobic and will hate them. When parents are involved, they will either, firstly throw their own child out of the home for this revelation, or reveal that they suspected all along, but were content to wait for their child to feel comfortable enough to admit it. So there's regular experiences of bullying, discomfort with gendered clothing, dress norms, and much more. So this is an example of actually Beldan Cézanne, one of the authors I discussed here, and how she discusses the coming out story, or coming out on really the first page of her Snapshots of a Girl that she published in 2015. She describes the value and necessity of coming out by writing this graphic novel, memoir. So coming out really is, or it's a stepping out of the unseen, about claiming space, as Sophie already mentioned, about being seen, about naming things, about knowing, being visible. It's not about fixing anyone's identity and place, but it is about claiming a past and a present, and importantly about disturbing the polite agreement of shared silence, of refusal of being silenced, and also sort of an interest also in causing discomfort. So there is something political, personal and political about memoirs, LGBTQI memoirs. So I start with color names and sort of actually in a black and white comic, and the way because actually a lot of these memoirs are not using a lot of color, but they are using color names. They're some of them are also not using color just because economic reasons. It's expensive to publish. But this is Liz Prince's graphic memoir Tomboy from 2014. She published that in her mid-30s. I find that kind of interesting or important because it also tells us about color conventions, because colors aren't universally always the same. The codes are different depending on what historical era. So it kind of depends also when the person wrote it, the age of the person, and the age of the avatar, or the fictional the person in the comic. So this is clearly Liz Prince, who is boy identified, and describes that struggle with her gender identity and her sexual identity. Her memoir is told through short related stories starting from Prince's early childhood experiences and ending when Prince is a teenager and has slowly learned to define herself as a masculine woman, or butch, on her own terms. An important feature is gendered dress norms, and here she describes her favorite outfit, and that is notably a red baseball cap and a well-worn gray blazer. So it's a narrative disidentification with specific color schemes and specific colors as a shorthand for her disidentification with gender and sexual norms. Here it's pink that is being singled out as something that she was made to wear, and coupled with lovely and frilly and dainty and reserved. Those are all the notions of femininity that to Liz Prince are actually provoke a very emotional guttural response. Black, it's like sort of really something that she does not want on her body. And she also combines it with the well-known nursery rhyme, Sugar Spice and Everything Nice. So those are the connotations that Liz Prince sort of draws herself with, as in order to express her discomfort with the gender norms, sexual norms. So similarly, Alison Bechdel in Fun Home also, actually doesn't use many colors. It's this greenish tint, or blue greenish tint, but she uses color names in a bit of a similar way that Liz Prince uses it. But here, as you probably all know, the graphic memoir is also not just about Alison, but the relationship very much of her and her father. And color actually works as a way to grapple with that relationship, or also a way of disidentifying with her father, or sort of trying to understand what there is. So here too, the father tries to tell her what her room should look like. He was very invested in decorating and ornamental Baroque stuff, and to Alison, or her character in the graphic memoir, the response is, but I hate pink, I hate flowers. Again, this coupling of pink and flowers that comes up later on. Here it's more sort of about gender norms, about her childhood room and what it's supposed to look like. Later on, it's sort of her father that she couples with also flowery things, and then also a well-known gay trope, the pansy. So Bechdel contrasts her father's preference for all things ornamental, Baroque, and colorful with her own no-nonsense functional style and dark blue color preference. And she states at one point, I grew to resent the way my father treated his furniture like children and his children like furniture. And another quote, my own decided preference for the unadorned and purely functional emerged early when I grew up. When I grew up, my house is going to be all metal like a submarine. And her dislike of elaborate color schemes expresses her desire to be free from the way her father's sense of style overpowers everyone in the family. Here symbolized by the yellow turtleneck that he makes her put on. And she really couldn't care less what she wore. And he would, always be like, oh, that doesn't match, that's not, that doesn't work. And here another way that he would sort of butt in and overshadow her ways of or her space actually as a child sort of developing, is when she's actually coloring a story and using her favorite color, dark blue, which is not so unsurprising that she actually prefers dark blue and not pink, which is obviously about gender as well. But then the father comes in and says, he quickly butts in and takes over. Your blue side will be in shadow, while his becomes a cryonic tour de force. So this is actually the panel where he, sort of takes over. And then, okay. So these are the ways that color names are being used, but what really fascinated me most is this graphic memoir, Blue is the Warmest Color by Julie Moreau. Is a French graphic memoir that ended up being a film and that became quite well known. She also uses color names and quite elaborate, but here it's the color blue, and it's also deeply gendered and sexualized. It comes to stand for, sexual desire, lesbian desire, really, and also a sort of awakening. And so when Emma, which is the main character, talks in this, actually reads the letter by her girlfriend Clementine, who has just passed away recently, untimely death, and she reads in the letter, "Blue has become the warmest color." It suggests that this desire for blue, for the lesbian love, is actually sort of queered in the sense that blue is not cool like in conventional understandings, but it's actually the warmest color. It's hot. So Moreau really works with different ways, works color in different ways, and to queer it, in my understanding, and also to queer temporalities. She uses for the past, and those are diary entries of Clementine. She uses black and white or gray shades with splashes of blue, and namely it's always the hair of Emma. And Emma is readily read by also the classmates of Clementine as a lesbian, as gay. And sort of this blue hair becomes code for lesbian desire throughout, but also sort of the past in this black and white, and then blue shades, yellowish blue shades, greenish shades for the present. So here we have the past and splash of the blue hair. Here you have the diary. So blue is not just lesbian desire, but it's also sort of truth, the truth that Clementine has learned to live. She ends up writing a diary, and the diary is what's left in the end, and Emma gets to read the diary once after Clementine is already passed away. So another way that blue signifies sort of the authentic self of Clementine, and also sort of an awakening, is she has a dream, and before she actually really realizes that she might be a lesbian or have same-sex desires, and has this dream, and then wakes up from this dream, and this is sort of described in the diary. So this is sort of when the past merges with the here and now, and I find that interesting, sort of how this switch, or sort of when this is the diary being read by Emma in actually Clementine's former bedroom in her parental home. So it's this fuzzy, blurry panels that I find quite interesting, and I always find it as could be read as some kind of queering of temporality and this overlapping of different temporalities. Another way that temporality is being used here in a different comic on Transitioning by Sabrina Symington is First Year Out. And here too is just how are specific, very seminal moments expressed. And here you have the sort of very hyper-gendered way of the moment when she gets the letter that she can get gender affirming surgery. And here flashback when she longs for the pink dress, and is sort of basically though asked by her dad to choose a suit, a dark color suit. I guess I'm going to leave it at that. I would have much more to say, maybe in the Q&A, but thank you very much, and later.
There's lots of overlapping themes, yes. I think we'll see.
Great.
Yeah. So again, Memoirs of Growing Up offer perspectives on childhood from a wide range of times, places, and situations. What I'm going to emphasize here, and I think we're hearing the theme, graphic memoirs in particular add a really rich visual dimension that accounts for past childhood beyond those you can't convey with words. And I think we're hearing all different takes on this, and this is going to be another one. Like Sophie, I'm going to be emphasizing a look at spaces of childhood and thinking about how the perspective literally of the child is or isn't represented in very specific kinds of spaces, and how we're thinking both not just metaphorically but literally in a way about point of view. And those are the kinds of questions I want to explore when thinking about childhoods in particular as they're represented in visual graphic memoirs. How do they see their childhood? How do they remember seeing their childhood? And how do they get us to see it, right? That's the question here. I'm going to look at several kinds of dimensions here, how the child's positionality is placed in the memoir, how choices about visual representation contribute to the memoir's plot itself and its impact on the reader, and how, and this again relates to a couple of points that have been already made, how graphic memoir authors literally use the images to document as forms of documentation. I think that was a big theme in Sophie's paper too, reproducing the documents in a different form. I also wanted to raise the question particularly of perspective in the sort of way we usually think about it, not visually, first person versus third person. Again, I started coming from reading text memoirs that written in the first person, but here we see that artists also choose to depict themselves in either the third person as in the top view or the first person. So either seeing themselves in the picture to be part of the action, or seeing the world as it looked from their eyes. And so I think we see people playing with those questions of perspective and spaces as well. I'm going to be focusing on 6 different memoirs. I'm going to be looking at the spatial environments of childhood as represented in a set of graphic memoirs by 6 authors, all of whom eventually became professional artists, and all were born in the mid-20th century. So that's what contains them in some ways as a group. Graphic memoir has rapidly become a global phenomenon, and so I started with some of the stories we've already been hearing about, some of the classic American stories, but then I wanted to look around the world at people who had grown up at around the same time, but in really different settings. So my first example was mentioned quickly in one of the presentations is Mouse by Art Spiegelman. That's not this, by the way. I'll go back here now to my actual first one. A work that played a hugely significant role in the genre of graphic memoir. It's simultaneously a memoir and a life story because it's the story of Art collecting his father's story. So it's a second generation Holocaust story. It's not just a memoir, then it's also Holocaust history, and because of that, Spiegelman was obsessed with documentation. According to Ruth Franklin, Spiegelman was obsessively focused on getting the visual details right, consulting drawings by survivors, photographs, and maps to ensure that nothing was misrepresented. Franklin points out the seeming paradox here. There's something mildly lunatic about insisting on this sort of verisimilitude in a story in which all the people appear as animals. Or is there? Franklin reminds us of the genre debate raised by the publication of Mouse 2 in 1991. The New York Times book review bestseller list placed it in the fiction category, and Spiegelman very quickly objected. I shudder to think how Holocaust denier David Duke would respond to seeing a carefully researched work based closely on my father's memories of life in Hitler's Europe and the death camps classified as fiction. And here I always draw the distinction between graphic memoir claims and graphic novel claims, and don't like to keep those apart. The concern with visual is apparent in the images of the settings of a life story told by Art by his father, such as the iconic gates of Auschwitz, but also in the depictions of the family's home in Regal Park, New York, where the life story actually was lived and told. In terms of visual perspective, Spiegelman mostly deploys third person. Images include the preface here, where we're seeing where that launches the story. His father begins his active memory in the driveway of their house in Regal Park. Art was about 10 years old. He'd been on the sidewalk skating with friends when his father starts the story in a very dramatic way. And we see that again, that representation of this very particular, very modest milieu is important to Spiegelman. But we also see another depiction of an important scene from Art's youth, and that is the scene of his mother's suicide when he was 20. In representing himself going through this trauma, Art depicts himself as a prisoner in uniform. He had recently been released from an asylum, and the image slips between sort of the guilty memories of his last encounter with his mother in the family home before he was institutionalized, and the prison of the asylum here, I think, reflecting on his own guilt of having contributed to his mother's suicide. So he's directly connecting then his perspectivity here with his developing subject and, I think, self-identity through these various visual techniques and representing memory. A second example makes the connection between depiction of subjectivity even more explicit. The 2009 graphic memoir Stitches by David Small highlights visualization and alternating perspectives I've already mentioned. Stitches tells the story of Small's growing up in an emotionally cold atmosphere, his bout with thyroid cancer that left him literally voiceless. Perspectivity figures literally and metaphorically. He begins by drawing a bird's eye view of the city of Detroit where he grew up, then moves into a more typically third person perspective as he goes into the home. We see that, and he then moves from this third person to the first person, going back and forth. And I think we can see a direct connection between this perspectivity and the emotional state, especially the coldness and distance he associates with his family life. He's recalling himself as a seeing subject, but one without a lot of agency, beyond escaping into his own imagination by drawing. And that's there very early on in the picture. We see the reproduction of the child's eye view, but what we're seeing is a small person looking up at looming and frightening adults, relaying subjective feelings of vulnerability rather than agency. Agency would only come later when he literally escapes. So in Stitches, Small's memoirs are represented almost exclusively through images, almost wordlessly, very little text. And that plots the story because, again, we find out that later his father was a radiologist who had practiced radiology on his son in order to cure mild childhood diseases, ended up giving him thyroid cancer, which left him literally voiceless. So it's a very complicated story, but one which he uses the play off of silence and imagery and drawing. And we finally see him becoming a graphic artist, a cartoonist, leaving home at age 16 to escape this site of the home as his site of trauma. Finally, the other example, which I probably won't have to talk a lot about because several people already have done so, Bechdel. Again, I'm using these very well-known kind of iconic examples because I see these uses of space as being interesting and similar in some ways. Obviously, Bechdel is known for her precise visual detail. Again, she was born in the 1960s, so just a decade after the previous two I was talking about. So graphic memoirs were already a thing by the time, in some ways, she was beginning to think about drawing. But she uses, I think, the genre in a very specific way. And I want to just show a couple of examples. We've seen some already, but here I want to emphasize the spatial dimensions again, and particularly the home, right? The fun home, which is the place of her childhood. Here she's showing her father in a moment of anger of his house, as we've already heard, meticulous attention, but then he gets angry. He throws something on the floor and leaves what she calls a permanent linoleum scar. That permanent scar, no doubt, reinforced her memory of this incident of violence, but also it left an imprint on the house itself, a trace, right? So a trace in her memory, but also a trace in the house. The memoir dwells on her father's death when Allison was 20, a death she deemed to be a suicide, but that death affected her coming of age much in the same way that Art Spiegelman's mother's suicide affected his. And it plots her retrospective account. That is the plot, right, to figure out the mystery. Documents play a big role in puzzling out the story. These include, for example, drawings of newspapers, headlines, family photos, and especially diary entries. So we see her own self-authored documents being redrawn, right, from her own childhood diaries that document her obsessive-compulsive disorder and her efforts to grapple with it. So as Bechdel leads us through the various memories and documents, we learn of her father's struggle as a closeted gay man in a small town in Pennsylvania in the 1960s and 70s. We simultaneously watch Bechdel's own emerging subjectivity, changing perspective, and developing agency. Despite the strict regimentation her father attempted to impose on the family. The family fun home is the site of all of Bechdel's important moments of growing up. And as in the two previous examples, it's also a place from which she has to escape. So again, I'm not going to make the claim here that these are classic American stories, right? These are exceptional American stories of childhood. But it's telling that these are in some ways the most influential launching of the genre kind of narratives, and ones that have resonated with huge audiences, not just in the US, but elsewhere, and have been powerfully influential in shaping the genre of graphic memoir. And in all of them, they represent the home as both a predominant space of childhood and the site of personal trauma or psychic damage from which escape had to happen. And then, so that's where I want to now turn with these visualizations with several examples by prominent artists from other parts of the globe who are growing up at the same time, but in very different political, geographic spaces. And that, I think, highlights the cultural particularity of the American stories. So the three I'm going to talk about very quickly. Lot, who was born in Malaysia in 1951, Lee Kun Woo, who was born in China in 1955, and Mogorosi Mochumi, who was born in South Africa also in 1955. So Lat began drawing when he was very young. Not this young. He had his first cartoon published when he was just 13, and he was earning a regular income as a cartoonist by the time he was 17. This is from Kampung Boy. His memoir was published in 1979 when he was just 28. And it's a strong narrative line evincing nostalgia for the village, the kampung, in which he grew up and spent his first 11 years. The memories are mostly comic and sweet, although young Lat does get into trouble with his mother when he runs off from chores, such as this one, taking care of his younger siblings, or when he runs off with friends to have fun and his parents don't really approve of his friends or his fun. Still, by and large, the images and the perspectives they reconstruct are very, I say, loving, nostalgic, and mostly out of doors in a benign environment. There are adults around somewhere, but they're very rarely depicted. Moreover, in contrast with the constrained and troubled domestic spaces we saw in the American graphic memoirs, Lat's family home, when you see it, is quite permeable. Literally, the walls are open. It's, people walking in and out, and it's just one of many spaces in which the childhood is lived. I think the appeal to Malaysian readers and the story Lat wanted to tell through his childhood memories hinged on the portrayal of culturally specific Malay spaces, the Malay villages of the past that were disappearing. The idea that these kampung could be a source of national pride and identity, even as globalization and urbanization threatened to destroy these old forms of life. Politics, whether national or local or global, are peripheralized. They're not in there in the name of constructing a shared nostalgic space of traditional pre-urban childhood. Here, the home is not a place to escape, but rather a space to which to return. And in fact, Locke did move back as a successful adult cartoonist to his kampung. Now that's one story, but I think the Chinese one is maybe even a bit more surprising in that this is again Li Kunwu's Chinese life, also a memoir of growing up, this time during the most contentious and violent episodes of modern Chinese history, but it also evokes nostalgia for that past in a surprising kind of way. The present from which Li writes is that of the early 21st century, by which time the Chinese regime had departed from most of its originary revolutionary program. But there are still continuities in political style, and Li himself actually has worked for the Chinese state as an official illustrator his whole adult life. And so, he has to navigate a very tricky, already? Oh my God, okay, he has to navigate a tricky political terrain. You don't hear about Tibet, you don't hear about Tiananmen Square. His choice was to draw things he knew, saw, experienced. So you see in his drawings, this home life a little bit. It's again small, crowded, but they're looking out. But a lot of it again takes place in the streets, and these are places where he's going out to as part of the rat killing campaign, part of a government crusade. So again, he manages to turn childhood memories of nostalgia for a time that was better, in which he was doing interesting and important things with his family, in which the regime still stood for something, even though, of course, in the background you're not seeing all the horrific sides of it. I'll take really quickly one last example, which I think is important to put in the picture too, and that is Mochumi's The Initiation. And here we have the example. He's the very first Black South African illustrator to write in this genre, the first memoir of this sort, and it's completely political. I guess that's the message. It's all politicized. There's no escaping politics. He later on would write explicitly about his own involvement in anti-apartheid dissent, but the political frame is never absent, even from the earliest moments. Here we see the very first opening scene where the police are coming to his home, where he's living in a Black homeland with his grandmother, because his parents are like most people Black people at this time living in the city, and they're coming to arrest him and his grandmother and his neighbor because they're behind in the rent payment, and he's worried about being late for school and getting thrashed at school because he's not going to be there on time. So that's very political from the beginning, and we see also a lot of street scenes, and the streets are again both appealing and dangerous. They're the sites of drugs, they're the sites of politics, they're the sites of bullying, and they're also the sites of his politicization. So I guess the big point here is, again, like the other two I've showed from the Global South, the home isn't such a big deal, but when it is, in this case specifically, there's no nostalgia about it. It's already a site of oppression, as it had to have been in the case of the apartheid regime, and there's no possibility of escaping the politics. He's growing up. Whatever space he's growing up is in political. Now, I would say, obviously, that's true generally, but this is very explicit, and it's also a space that he needs to escape from, but not alone. It's not about personal trauma, it's about a community that has to work together to escape this system of apartheid. So again, I think I better stop there, but I think you can see the themes coming out, the interior and exterior spaces, their connections and the borders, and the politicization that is part of the frame of all the adult storytellers, and the placing themselves in spaces as part of the story they need to tell. Thank you.
So first of all, I'd like to once again state that I have enjoyed all of your provoking presentations. And I have just a few comments and questions to all of you, because I think that all of us have a lot of questions, so I don't want to just, I'm talking for 15 minutes and we'll end up with no discussion. So while all of your papers touch upon various issues, there are also many similarities between them. As Michael Roth argues, in modernity, memory is a key to personal and collective identity, the core of the psychological self. You all talked about graphic memoirs that not only represent the author's individual memory, but also have the potential to produce second-generation memory. Anastasia Ulanovich observes that texts that seek to produce second-generation memory are significantly different from those that attempt to represent it, insofar as the former implied that an individual's effective relationship to the past might be achieved just as much through lateral acts of empathy and analogy as they are through the maintenance of vertical or family structure genealogies. Focusing on the generational relationality of memory and post-memory, Ulanovich introduces the term second-generation memory as a form of collective memory that involves an individual's conscious incorporation of her elders' memories of a traumatic past within her own mnemonic repertoire. So such memory involves an individual's affirmation of and sense of participation in a given demographic's shared narrative of its past. This is a question to all of you. So do texts that you have just so brilliantly discussed have such a mnemonic potential? You all talk about graphic memoirs representing childhood and adolescence, yet books that I would not classify as children's literature. So can you tell us who is the implied reader of these books? So these are questions to all of you. And when it comes to more individual questions that I have, Sophie, can you tell us something more about the circulation of Darkroom and the critical reader response? What was the response among the scholars of civil rights movement, for example? Was this book published in other countries? And would you call Darkroom a Bildungsroman or just a coming-of-age story? MK, first of all, it's an honor to have you here because you're not a typical scholar. You're one of the authors, so we're very happy to have you here. So you can probably tell us more about the process of writing graphic novels. And I think that what you're doing is extremely important. And so how important was the therapeutic part of the writing process for you as an author? And have you thought about translating your memoir into other languages? Because I think that it definitely should be translated into other languages and published in other countries, in European countries, African countries struggling with the HIV/AIDS crisis now, in the 21st century. Dominique, once again, I'm looking forward to reading your book in pink. And I really think that the next one should be in a different color, and I think it's going to be blue, and I would love it. And when it comes to blue, I'm not sure if you know that in Russian, in the Russian language, when you say that a boy is blue, голубой, it means that he's gay. Yeah, so the significance of the color blue is differs from country to country, and here you're talking about blue as the color of representing lesbian love and so on. So this may be an interesting trope for you in your new research on blue. Yeah. So does the usage of blue as the masculine color reaffirm gender stereotypes in the graphic memoirs that you discussed, or maybe not? MJ. You compared 3 well-known memoirs classics with some that I was not familiar with, and that was a great thing to do, I think. Can you tell us how the relationship between adults and children is depicted in the non-American memoirs? Also, are they as intertextual and mature as, for example, Fun Home and Mouse are? So these are my quick, basic questions, and I have a lot of different questions and suggestions, but I'll let it open for discussion, so we can start with answering maybe my comments and questions.
So you asked about the response to the book?
Yeah, the response.
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of like very well received and reviewed, and it was translated into Spanish, for sure. I think also 1 or 2 other languages, but I'm not entirely sure. I think you also asked who it was directed towards, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's written from like the child's perspective.
Yeah.
I think it's also taught in schools. Yeah. So yeah, it's used for that as well.
Okay, so I can go next. So I talked a little bit about the sense of who is the reader. For my book, obviously I'm speaking from the intentionality of the creator. So it's published by an academic press, which is really unusual. So obviously there was an intention all along for it to be used as in that context. But when I was making it, I was really thinking about, as I mentioned, the people who were there and the people who weren't there, and that there was very two different things, but hopefully it all happened and works there. You talked about, or you asked about the therapeutic process in making it. Thinking not just beyond myself, but the larger idea of making comics about experiences that were traumatic. It's interesting because I work in the intersection of comics and health, and that's one of the areas where we see a lot of work happening. Cartoonists working with, or people working with art therapists around trauma, either sexual trauma or war and violence. And I'm really fascinated by some of the theory around that, like the idea that when you make a comic, you actually have, you're in charge of all the choices. Like the person is empowered to be in charge of all the choices, like the color, the space, what's shown, what's not space, what's in the frames, what's out, how time progresses, all of that. So you suddenly, or through this process, can have agency over something over which you had no agency, right? The trauma itself. So in a way that's really helpful. And also, and this speaks to my own experience of it as well, the things I hear are that it's something that you are also in the act of doing a comic about trauma, you are externalizing it. And for me, that was very much the case. These were all things, these memories that sort of were very much present with me. And in the act of externalizing them, I now have this object in the world that I can engage with, but they don't take, these memories don't have as much power over me in a negative way because I've gone through this process and made them external. So.
Yeah, I think the way MK described it for her process, it sounds like a lot of the, when I read interviews by some of the authors that of the books that I portrayed, they have very similar stories. If that's what that's the work that actually producing this graphic memoir did, is working through. And I think that's where also your question to me is it reaffirming gender norms? Yes and no. It's a working through gender norms. I mean, they're born in this world where there are gender norms and they're oppressive and they've suffer. So it is a way of working with what's there. So yes, some of it is affirming also notions of authenticity, of that's real, my real self, and this is how I had to be, and all these things that we might look at critically, but this is how they experienced it. And I do think there is in this Julie Melmo's Blue is the Warmest Color, there is potential of queering also. I do think there's a lot of blurring. It's in a way also color is being used and then resignified as hot and not cool, and of course color is historically very specific. I would never make universal claims about color at all. And I do think it's interesting how these novels travel, or these memoirs, and so many of them have been translated in different languages. So has Julie Melmo's, and how then.
Actually, the Chinese one was originally published in French, not in Chinese. I don't think it's been published in Chinese yet. That's another way to avoid the politics. Yeah,
one of the Bellanceses is a German Turkish woman, and she has it published in Italy, but it's in English. Wow. So it's like this, welcome to the 21st century.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. And those are also really good questions, thanks. I guess and I'll try to be really quick. Adults and children, yes, very different. Again, it's almost, I hadn't thought of it in these terms, but the three that I picked, the American ones, they're all these nuclear families with intergenerational troubles. The parents are troubled and the children are troubled to one extent or another, and the relationships are troubled. In the other ones, there isn't that edge. In fact, the relationships in all the cases are, I would say, well, certainly in the cases of Watt and Lee, the parent-child relations are fine, but they're also diffused because it's not just the parents. It's not a story about the home and the parents. It's like there are many other kinds of adults in their lives. School teachers are important. Public officials are important to organize the marches and whatnot. Again, in law, it's funny. It's not. There's no officials. But it's a lot of other kinds of adults. So it's a very different kind of relationship, more diffuse and less pathological. And then in terms of the second question about again, that was really interesting, the intertextuality. I would say it's not there so much in Lodge because it's very simple drawings. They're just meant to evoke this calm, this again pre-literate almost, right? I think it's about pre-literacy, about simple visual memories. But with the other two, I think documentation is important. Well, Shumi certainly, because he really is documenting the injustice of apartheid, and so there's a lot, as I said, he even goes in, well, I guess I didn't say that, I have to go past too quickly, he even steps in and comments and provides documentation sometimes as a figure in his own childhood story. And I think for Lee Kung-woo it's important too, but he restricts himself to what he saw, but he wants to document what he saw as being authentic, so he shows posters that they carried during the rat campaign or whatever. So, yeah.
And we have questions.
It just really follow up quickly to MJ to what you were saying. I was really struck by the non-American memoirs. They were often people that had written in the 50s.
They're all the same age. All of the six authors are all roughly, I mean not the same, but within a decade. So between 1945 and 1960, they were all born and they all grew up.
In the
same time, but different places. Right?
I'm just wondering if younger generations, especially from the non-American context, if they would write different stories because these, Malaysia and China and South Africa has changed so much in their lifetime. Would it be less nostalgic, or have you looked at memoirs from a younger generation?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that's the an obvious kind of follow-up question. This is just the beginning of this project. I started with the classics and I started to branch out. Of course, the answer is yes. I know it without even reading any of them. The stories will be different. But I think it's not just, so it's an intersection of the framework from which they're writing as adults and the framework they grew up in. Those are always intersected. Yeah. And I would say it's true also of American stories. These are stories, think about it, when these are growing up in they're growing up in the 50s and the 60s when this is classic idealist. Anyway, so yeah, that's a good point, and I think it would be a great one that I will be following up on. Yeah.
We have time for 2-3 more questions, short ones.
Okay, I'm Emily Bruce, University of Minnesota Morris, and I just thought each of these presentations was superb. Thank you so much, it was terrific. My question's a little lateral. I was already thinking of it before MK showed us the tree ring idea, which is awesome. But I just wondered, I know a couple of you, at least MJ and MK, are teaching with graphics, with comics, teaching graphic memoirs, some ways teaching with drawing. And I don't know about you, Dominique and Sophie, whether you've taught these texts, but any reflections on what happens in the classroom when you use graphic memoirs? Are students reflecting on their own childhoods? What kinds of classes have you used them in? Where do you see them helping students see history in a different way than maybe conventional text-only readings would be given to students? So I actually know what MJ does with them, but
So I teach in a couple of different contexts. Usually around health and thinking about health and experiences within the structures of medicine, I guess. And so I teach at Northwestern in the med school, and one of the things I do, so both with drawing, so my students will draw about their experiences of becoming doctors and their interaction with the system, both as doctors to be and as providers and family members. And then they also read graphic memoir about living with illness and caregiving. So like we'll read My Degeneration, about being diagnosed with and living with Parkinson's. And the goals are different. The goal with reading the text is to have a different window in through the panels of the comics, the experience of living with illness that they're not going to get in a clinic visit, right, because they're seeing them in a clinical environment. That these books give us a chance to see someone at home and their family members in the context in which they live. And the thing I always say about that teaching is my hope is that, not that they can universalize that experience so that, when they meet someone newly diagnosed with cancer or Parkinson's or whatever the book covered, I don't think that now they know what that's like, but they can maybe ask more informed questions is my goal with my students in that. And then for the drawing part, what I'm really getting them to look at is using shifting positionality of who they draw themselves and the context in which they draw themselves and the movement of time. So for example, I have a thing to draw a clinical encounter, and I let them stare at me for a minute before they figure out what they're going to draw, because I don't give them any more information, so they can choose their positionality in it. Are you the patient? Are you the family? Are you the new doctor? And I want them to go to wherever they want. And then I have them draw what came before and what came after that middle drawing, so they can start doing these moves of empathy. A lot of times they draw themselves as this medical student who has no idea what's going on, but they have to pretend they do. And then in drawing them before, they often shift to the perspective of the patient, and they'll draw the room why the patient was so cranky because they realized they'd been waiting for so long, and then going on. So I try to do all kinds of things. I don't know if that answers your
That's
question.
so great, thank you. That's really helpful.
Well, I use children's books. I haven't used graphic memoirs except maybe one little vignette. I have them usually start, if it's a history of childhood course, I have them start with a collage. So I've had them, sort of make collages of their own childhood from different magazines or different material that I've read. And that's really, really fun and generative. Also to have them reflect on their own child and how that informs their, sort of looking at childhood historically, and that actually really works.
Yeah, so last year I've taught a course about methods how to analyze comics with a gendered perspective. And for most of my students, they had never read graphic memoirs before, so it was really this new experience, and but they really liked it. Yeah. So for them it was really interesting to work with the visual aspects as well, and that was very new to them. Yeah, so
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we do not have more time for questions, but let's give them a big round of applause.
Thank you for listening to Shisai Podcasts. You can find more materials and features from the Society for the History of Children and Youth online, shcy.org.